Hi, everyone. Officially welcome and good evening or good afternoon, possibly good morning, wherever you're tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. My name is Hala Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am pleased to welcome you to today's live author reading of new memoirs from the press. We're going to be hearing from Dane Wycoff, author of A White Duck in a Black Pond, Race, Identity, and Privilege, released on June 24th. Douglas Dodd, author of Our Father Who Art in an Iron Lung, a memoir released on July 8th, and Dan Morgan, author of Hiraeth, The Voice of Home, released on August 12th. All three authors' books can be purchased from online retailers as well as from select bookstores. Of course, you can also find the books on Atmosphere Press's website. That's at atmospherepress.com/books. But I'm also going to put the direct links to each of these three books in the chat for you all, so you can check that out. At the end of today's event, or at least at the end of the readings, we're going to have time for your questions. So during the readings, if you think of a question for one or more of our authors, you can put those in the chat and I will make sure they get asked. Please do stay muted for the duration of the event, but in the meantime, you can feel free to use the chat for praise or comments in addition to your questions. One last note is that we at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. If you have a manuscript of your own, we would love to read it, so submit your work today to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in to support Dane, Doug, and Dan today. It's a great, thrilling use of alliteration for this event. We're going to start off with our first reader, who is Dane Wycoff. Dane was raised in Los Angeles. His foray into writing began with poems celebrating women's divinity, compassion, and universality. He later wrote several experiential essays that serve as pillars of his life story. He also self-published his wife's memoir, which explores themes of race, gender, and cultural relevance. Although he completed only middle school, he went on to graduate as valedictorian in his BS program and earned his MBA magna cum laude. He currently resides in Lake Forest, California. A White Duck in a Black Pond is his first full-length book. And this book is a compelling memoir as engrossing, relevant, and timely today as decades ago. Being the son of a white mother and an African-American father during the 1950s presented challenges on its own, but the bane of Dane's existence wasn't that he was mixed. It was because he believed himself 100% Black despite his white skin. His chosen identity led to an endless wave of rejection, violence, and torment. We're going to hear more of this story unfold now from Dane himself.
Thank you, Hala, for including me in today's author presentations. My memoir, A White Duck in a Black Pond, Race, Identity, and Privilege, is a nonfiction account of many of my life experiences, beginning at age 5 and spanning 7 decades. The book's primary theme focuses on how I've continued to identify racially, culturally, and ethnically throughout the various phases of my existence. Today, I'm going to read from the chapter entitled Street Life. Most of the impact from my grandfather's hand was against the right side of my head, but fortunately, nothing was broken. My face smarted for a couple of days and was sore when chewing, but being able to think and feel as pleased vanquished my temporary discomfort. Fully aware of his short fuse, I knew spending the weekend at my aunt's place without permission would bait my grandfather into hysteria. Except for being slugged, his enraged outburst was predictable. Even though his unbridled assault was painful, it offered me a way out of their house, possibly the only way. My grandmother, who normally succumbed to her husband's imperious will, went ballistic at his ordering me away. Although he retracted almost immediately, I was long gone. Hysterically, she demanded my father find me and screeched, "Don't come back without baby boy." She and Aunt Doris called me baby boy for as long as I could remember. The evening I fled from my grandparents' home was reminiscent of when we moved from the Aliso Village projects, exited Mount Vernon Middle School the day of my expulsion, and the night I left my mother's home in search for a new life with a father whose protection I needed desperately. But as in those instances, I had no idea what lay ahead, nor was there a contingency plan if I was unable to live with my aunt. Despite the uncertainty, I began the 2-mile trek to Aunt Doris's. The time had come to escape my grandparents' judgmental attitudes and anti-Black sentiments. Once I arrived at her flat, she frantically cautioned, "Your dad is on the way. You have to go back to your grandmother's or run away. He's not going to let you stay here." Her words reminded me of the beating he gave me with a 2x4 2 years prior, just because I refused to reside with his parents. Not surprised at my decision to run, Doris handed me her favorite baseball jacket and two $20 bills. Sobbing, she cried, "This is all I can give you, baby boy." Knowing how much she revered that coat made receiving it very special, and I was deeply disheartened when forced to trade it for a place to sleep. After kissing my aunt goodbye, I caught a bus to my old stomping grounds in mid-Los Angeles. Already getting dark and the temperature dropping rapidly, my priority was to find a place to sleep that night. Ronnie's house appeared to be the best choice. When I arrived, his brother stood huddled in a peacoat and was smoking a doobie on the front porch. After a long inhale, he nasally called out, "What up, gray boy?" A condescending term for white. Knowing no whites lived in the neighborhood, he must have deduced my being at least part African American. Acknowledging he was high as a kite, I just ignored his obnoxious sarcasm. Bundled in a hooded sweatshirt, Ronnie stepped outside for a toke. He recognized me after a moment and passed the joint my way. A couple of deep drags were nerve-settling and eased the tension of my sudden arrival. To my relief, he agreed to hide me out for a week. Exhausted from the day's trials, sleeping under his bunk sounded wonderful. As anticipated, it cost me $5 up front, which included a yucky cheese sandwich made with cheap white bread, the kind kids peeled the edges off and threw the inner dough at each other. Throughout that evening, I hardly slept a wink. The floor was hard as concrete, and the springs under his mattress hung barely above my forehead. It was unfortunate I hadn't arrived a few minutes earlier in time for 3 or 4 more hits of weed, which would have helped keep the day's happenings down. Along with the awful cheese and bread crust, the ambivalence of what was coming next created a lump in both my throat and stomach. The claustrophobic night was further drawn out as my mind was bombarded with thoughts of where to seek employment. The $40 from Aunt Doris wasn't going to last long. Despite my emotional setbacks, I was a hard worker with an exemplary work ethic. My grandparents' desire for me to live with them was an affirmation of my diligence and dependability. Whether ironing sheets, cutting lawns, painting house siding, or loading furniture in and out of my grandfather's moving van, everyone thought highly of my conscientiousness. Realizing that no law-abiding employer would hire a boy under 16, I considered stealing newspapers from paper racks and reselling them, as I was often forced to do by the two unscrupulous bullies in Aliso Village. However, the thought of beginning a new life having to steal was foreboding, but thinking about newspapers was propitious and provided a place to start. The following morning, I went to the Los Angeles Times office on Jefferson Boulevard. Curious about my appearance, the manager queried, "What do you need, son?" "I'm looking for work, sir." Do you have a driver's license and car? Because we're short a delivery man. No, sir, I don't. I'm trying to get off to a new start. Just as I turned to leave, he introduced himself as Sal and asked me to sit. His eyes scanned me thoroughly as he attempted to determine my ethnicity. My darkened mustache must have convinced him of my age eligibility because that didn't come up. He paused momentarily and asked, "On your way into the office, did you notice that all of the employees are African American?" I did. "And you're okay with that?" "Yes, sir. My father is Black." "Would you mind my asking your mother's background?" Presuming I'm Jewish, I explained, "She's Russian Jew. Her father is Ukrainian and her mother Belarusian." He smiled and asked, "Are you willing to work part-time, 3 hours per morning, 7 days a week?" "Absolutely," I answered, springing up from my seat. Sal continued, "Your job will be to assemble the different sections of the newspaper in preparation for delivery. The work hours are 4:30 to 7:30 each morning. Weekdays and Saturday pay $4 and Sundays pay $5. My work there began soon after and was steady for the 9 months I resided in the vicinity. Sal was always courteous to me, and while he never indicated that my being half Jewish had anything to do with his hiring me, it was almost certain it did. This was the only job I ever had where the employer knew my actual ethnicity. The rapport I developed with the deliverers was reasonably good, but there were a couple of hard cases who resented me. One employee had a younger brother who was next in line to become an assembler. That deliverer believed my being hired first was due to color, the managers, and in all probability, he was right. The guys I assembled papers for were older, mostly in their 20s, and didn't object to my being a part white kid. Instead, they nicknamed me Whitey, but said it in an uncontentious way. When I formerly belonged to the baby bartender gang, the guys called me Yellow, short for yellow nigga, so I was used to benevolent ridiculing. It was a godsend that finding work came quickly, but locating shelter was another matter altogether. For almost 12 weeks, I lived with friends, friends of friends, and friends of those friends. I slept in garages, attics, under beds, behind couches, in closets, and even on rooftops. Until getting ahead financially, I ate scraps my friends sneaked from their dining room tables. Hygiene was problematic too, and bathing had to wait until my friends' parents were away. This friendly assistance came at a price, often a stiff one. Although my earnings were ample at the time, I was unable to get ahead and soon discovered who my real friends were. To exacerbate matters, these were rebellious times, and the 1965 South Los Angeles Watts uprising was intensifying. In response, an area-wide curfew was implemented until daylight and was enforced by the National Guard. My starting time was well before dawn, so I was frequently stopped on the way to work, but allowed to pass almost immediately, likely due to my white exterior. During the last weekend I spent at Aunt Doris's, her community was under lockdown. Her apartment had an outside patio where I was smoking a cigarette and just checking out the street happenings. As the military police raced up and down the neighborhood enforcing the compulsory curfew, a Black guardsman slammed on the brakes of his Jeeps. With tires screeching and emitting smoke from burned rubber, he pointed his finger and gave me commanding eye contact. Yelling through his bullhorn, he ordered, "Get your Black ass in the house," and closed the door. Although I was completely startled, it made me feel good that he referred to my ass as Black instead of white. Of course, Who other than blacks or browns lived off the intersection of Santa Barbara and Budlong during that period? In any event, the guardsmen saw me as black, which was gratifying. This concludes my reading of Street Life chapter from the memoir, A White Duck in a Black Pond, Race, Identity, and Privilege. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dane, for that reading, especially for really immersing us immediately into this lived experience. I think that was a great way to kick us off today.
Thank you.
Reading, yeah, of course. Reading next today is Douglas Dodd. Doug is a retired home builder living with his wife, Jessica, in a converted warehouse in Dover, New Hampshire. Although retired, his children will always find reasons for him to bring his tools over to their houses to fix or build something. Before this memoir, his only writings of consequence, other than letters to friends and girlfriends, were specifications and contracts for his construction projects. When he's not working on family properties or his own home, Doug still continues to hike in the White Mountains of New Hampshire and will always find time to see his 3 daughters and 3 grandsons. Today, we'll be hearing Doug read from Our Father Who Art in an Iron Lung, in which in 1955, Bruce Dodd contracts polio and the lives of his wife and his 4 young children are forever changed. Bruce's paralysis and his dependence on respirators, however, did not define him. Rather, they revealed his strength. For the next 21 years, much of it spent in an iron lung, Bruce defied limitations and was a devoted father, mentor, and an unwavering source of inspiration. Through personal anecdotes, poetry, and heartfelt reflections, Our Father Who Art in an Iron Lung chronicles his journey. Doug, take the story away for us now.
Okay, thank you for having me. The chapter I'm reading today is called This Car is an Ambulance. So here we go. Death, or the possibility of death, was always lingering somewhere in our lives, and we got used to it. After my father first came home from the hospital in 1956, when I was 6 or almost 7, we used a variety of ambulance services to ferry him back and forth for the first few years. In those early days, it was maybe 2 or 3 times a year. This was when he was getting cold more often, and he would have to go back to the hospital. The Andover Fire Department did this for a while, but there was a point when it became too costly or unavailable to us. We were then forced to use the family station wagon as an ambulance. Someone had run an electric wire from the car battery to the backseat area, and that wire from the car battery powered the portable respirator when Dad traveled in the car. It was very much a jerry-rigged system and not the most reliable. In the early days of transporting him, my mother drove and I would go with her. You really needed 2 people so that the second person could sit in a split rear seat and tend to him during the drive. He was 100% paralyzed, by the way, which in those days often took more than an hour. It's unbelievable that despite the variety of people who sat in that split seat over the years, and despite their inexperience and lack of knowledge about the workings of the respirator and its connections, he never died during one of those trips, although it was often close. When I turned 16 and could drive, I became the preferred farrier of my father, either to the VA hospital or coming back home. By then, when I was driving, we had the maroon Ford Fairlane wagon, which was bigger and worked better than the Peugeot wagon. When we got to the hospital, we would drive around back to the ambulance entrance, park nearby, go in through the emergency door, and take the stretcher up to the 7th floor towards 7C. Later, it was 11C. Then we would find an orderly to help move him from the iron lung to the stretcher. I often made that trip to the hospital with my sister Allison, and during one memorable drive into Boston, we smoked pot. I was 16. We arrived stoned and headed up to his ward and greeted him with the usual touch or kiss on the forehead. He was happy to see us, and after a bit of chatting, Allison packed his small bag, and with help from an orderly, we moved him from the iron lung to the stretcher. Then we wheeled him to the elevator and headed down and out to the ambulance entrance. Amazingly, we weren't questioned that day, as stoned as we were, and actually we were never questioned whenever we arrived to take him home. We had written ambulance with a magic marker on a piece of cardboard that we put on the dashboard of the car. We were professional. My father was pretty tuned to us and had picked up on our stoned state and had gotten a bit of a contact high himself. We loaded him into the back of the station wagon, hooked up the respirator, and headed home. Allison remembers me driving around one of those then ubiquitous Massachusetts rotaries numerous times because we were stoned and having fun. My father, lying on the stretcher and connected to his portable respirator, got quite a bit kick out of what was happening. I can just imagine if we had been stopped. I think a cop would not have known what to do with us had that happened. But we made it home to Andover and moved him from the car into his room and into the iron lung. Whenever I drove or sat in the jump seat for my sister or my mother driving, we always made it home without any problems. But there were 2 times when the connection for the respirator failed. My father could maybe breathe without mechanical help for 40 minutes. And the trip from his iron lung in Andover to the iron lung at the VA took about an hour and 15 minutes. Twice there were issues with the portable respirator. I wasn't there either time, and I know I could have fixed it. Once in late 1971, the respirator failed when Patty, my sister, was in the back of the Ford wagon with my mother driving. My father stopped being able to talk and his lips turned blue. When they arrived at the hospital, they unloaded him and wheeled him into the emergency entrance. My mother ran for help and Patty gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Help arrived and they whisked him away from her, revived him without Patty or my mother knowing if he survived, and eventually put him back into his iron lung up in his ward. My sister Patty wrote a poem about that experience as part of her thesis for her master's program in creative writing. It's entitled Lighted Windows, and it's in the book, and I'm going to read it this afternoon. It's called Lighted Windows. Sunday afternoon, returning Dad to the Boston VA hospital. He's on the stretcher in the back of Mom's Ford station wagon. I crawl in next to him, drape my arm on top of his chest respirator, attached by a hose to an air pump. Please move your arms, Patty Cake, he says. It makes it harder to breathe. Together we watch lighted windows go by, lives amber lit in kitchens, living rooms. Suddenly his mouth opened, eyes bulging and wide. He seems to be pulling at the air. Dad? He's sucking too hard to answer. Mom, hurry, he's not breathing. Lights streak by. Yank off the chest respirator. Mom on one side, me on the other. Yank his stretcher out of the car. Rush him inside the hospital. Mom goes for help. His lips are turning blue. I lean over, squeeze his nose with my fingers, cover his mouth with mine, blow. His lungs rise and rise, stop, breathe in my air. His lungs sink, push my breath back in and in, take all my breath. An orderly says, I got him, grabs the stretcher, runs. I follow. In a cold room filled with determined machines, white coats flop him around. Raggedy Andy. He had polio, I yelled. He's paralyzed. A nurse looks up. What are you doing here? Wait outside. Outside, there is buckled asphalt and puffs of breath dissipating from a teenage girl sitting on a hard, wet curb, digging into her thighs and looking into a quiet amber moon far away through a cold blue, breathless sky. While I'm walking into his room, which is later, much later, I overhear my father saying to one of the young orderlies, last thing I remember, I was looking at windows and wondering how many of those bastards were making love. I hesitate, almost retreat, then move towards his head, protruding from the safety of the iron lung, and I kiss and kiss his cheek. I wasn't ready to let you go, I whisper. That's the end of the poem. Patty saved his life. It can only be said that it was her breaths into his lungs that saved him that day. Thank you, Patty. Before she was able to see him back in his iron lung up on 11C, she didn't know if he had died. She found a phone and called her sister Carol in Martha's Vineyard, where Sister Allison happened to be visiting also. And Patty told them he hadn't made it, and that he had died, because at first that's what she thought. And it was a couple of hours before she was told he did make it and was able to see him. Meanwhile, Allison and Carol thought he had died and were bouncing between disbelieving that it had happened and grieving his death, and then making plans to leave Martha's Vineyard to head up to Andover, until Patty finally reached them a second time to say that he hadn't died. I wasn't with them, and I probably wasn't near a phone, which is why I never got the call. I only heard about it later, and not for quite a bit later, since we were used to those near-death episodes. It was one of the, oh, by the way, Dad almost died a few months ago. I remember more than once taking a friend into my father's room, and just before we rounded the corner coming into his room, I would remember and I would say, oh, by the way, my father's paralyzed in an iron lung. I guess we were an oh, by the way family. The next time he nearly died, it was with his friend Sheila, who later became my mother-in-law and my mother's cousin, Sarah Brooks. My mother had enlisted Sarah and Sheila to drive to the VA to pick up my father from the hospital. Who knows where my mother was, and apparently it was another near-death situation. The portable chest respirator failed halfway to Andover. With Sheila in the jump seat and Beatty driving, they sped down Route 93 to our house on Main Street in Andover. My father had stopped talking. His breath was shallow and his lips had turned blue. Beatty ran to the house and called the fire department, who quickly showed up, resuscitated him, and got him transferred into his iron lung to receive those badly needed breaths. In retrospect, I really can't believe my mother asked those two women to do that. He survived that, and all the other times his life was entrusted to children, teenagers, and others who were totally inexperienced and truthfully unqualified. We children knew how to do it, and not everybody did. I also can't believe the two pot-smoking teenagers did it and didn't get stopped and arrested. I can't believe that none of those instances ever caused his death, and it was always so close. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I feel like I was right there in some of those moments. It was very evocative. So thank you for that reading tonight.
Thank you.
Of course. Our final reader for today is Dan Morgan. Dan is a Welsh-American sociologist, educator, and corporate trainer whose former professions include international roller derby skater and stand-up comic. He is also a gay man in recovery from drug addiction who has spent much of his life looking for a place to call home, including living on the streets. Before earning an MA in sociology and a doctorate degree in education, Dan held numerous jobs, many of them legal. He has co-authored a sociology textbook and published scholarly articles. This memoir is his first non-academic book. In this poignant, sharp, and at times heart-wrenching memoir, Hiraeth, The Voice of Home, Dan is a Welsh American from Pittsburgh and opens up about the throes of addiction, struggling with sexual identity, and searching for a place to fit without abandoning himself. He shares the highs and lows of his life, touching on his conflicts with family and faith, as well as his adventures in stand-up comedy, roller derby, and his role as a sociology professor. I'm excited now to welcome Dan.
Thank you, Hayla. And I wanted to say it's nice to see some familiar faces here in the room. Thanks for coming out. And you hold these every month, right? So if anybody who's here tonight wants to attend future atmosphere readings, let me know. If you're here to support me, and I'll give you the links. I did want to say something about the book. We were advised that this is to be, pretty much PG, and so I have selected just snippets from different parts of the memoir, which I'll share with you. Starting with the preface, which is called Natural Enemies. Vulnerability and my amygdala are always in opposition. A dog on the freeway is concerned for its very survival. It is in a heightened state of crisis, and its goals are simple: avoid harm and keep running. I have wanted to share this story with you for a long time, especially if you have felt like that dog on the freeway. What kept getting in the way is that I've had a lot of other more pressing decisions to make along the way. I have been afraid. Like a dog on the freeway, I've lived a great deal of my life in survival mode, dodging and hiding from what I perceived would harm or kill me. I was at the whim of my amygdala. Even later, as part of my career, I encouraged others to tell the truth about who they are and to be courageous. to ask questions, and to be curious about themselves and the world. I did all of this while hiding so much of who I am. The amygdala is the part of the brain that triggers the fight or flight response, and my amygdala works overtime. Quiet time is often unsettling for those who live with a hypervigilant amygdala. The quietude represents a foreboding stillness before the storm. Some have called it waiting for the other shoe to drop on steroids. For so long, there has been so little peace, only a temporary stillness that portends eventual, often imminent danger. For many years, I was that dog running on the freeway. What makes my life so interesting or compelling that anyone would care to read about me? I am unremarkable. I am not famous. I haven't found a cure for any illness or invented anything that has changed the course of human events. I've earned some degrees, diplomas, and certifications. I've performed for others and even gotten recognition along the way. Big deal. Countless others have achieved far more than I, have more letters after their names, and are even well known. What makes my voice so captivating that others would care to listen? Our voices connect us to our emotional realities. To have something to say affirms how we understand and express what it means to be a person. Voice is not only the reverberation and resonance that creates sound, our voices are also cultural, telling us when it is our turn to speak, which words to use, the rhythms and patterns of speech, how much we are allowed to say, vocal inflection, and what must be communicated without sound. When we have nothing left to say, or when we cannot find an emotional space to communicate, we lose the connection to our human reality. When we surrender our voice, we give up on relationships, all types, lovers, employers, friends, and others. When we lose this vital part of who we are, we can lose our minds. We live in darkness, mere representatives of ourselves to please and appease others and to fend off danger. No one knows who we are, and we become lonely imposters. This is not a sustainable identity. Living as a fraud is a path to mental illness, or at the very least, absence from the relationships that we have or want. I lost my voice and got disconnected from myself early on. As a result, I lost my way. Excuse me. I was a fat, sissy kid who grew up in the welfare system of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, living in the home of an uncle who took our family in because of my father's mental illness and drug addiction. As a young man, I lived on the streets. I have, and I'm going to paraphrase here, folks, done some things more than 1,000 times, often for gifts or a place to stay for the night. I lived for many years in a state of hopeless, helpless drug addiction. Hiding is a pattern, and I'm working hard to reverse that pattern. I hid from bigger kids on my way to grade school. I hid my desires for men, fearing shame or physical harm. As an adult, I hid the physical and psychological health challenges I have lived with over the years. I have spent a lot of time and energy feeling ashamed and afraid. I have witnessed 3 murders, each in front of places that I was supposed to call home. I tried to suppress all of these memories, only to have them surface in avoidant or aggressive behaviors. I live with post-traumatic stress, doing my best in a world where I still feel unwelcome. Consequently, I learned how to manage how I presented myself to others for fear of being found out or exposed, which would mean being in danger. Obeying these tyrannical internal voices may have made me feel safe in the moment, but it also kept me imprisoned, often creating havoc for me and those I encountered. Working through this wreckage and doing my best to live life authentically has required courage. It has been an ongoing practice. I am finally coming into my own voice, and I hope my experience will resonate with you on your journey to find and fully express your voice. This is not so much about finding self-esteem. It's about finding the courage to be who I am in any situation. I have paid dearly for hiding who I am to fit into my surroundings. This is about honoring myself, often standing up for myself in the face of people and circumstances who challenge my right to do so. This book is about coming home to myself, to a place I'm grateful, to myself, I'm on the wrong page, a place of emotional safety, and to a space where I treat myself and others with love and respect. It has been a long road to get here, and I am grateful to be on the path. I have taken time to reflect, to make sense of so many things I've done, how I perceived situations, how I behaved, and the consequences of my actions. I am learning to stand up for myself without hesitation, reservation, or limitation. In many ways, we are not unique. This glimpse into my history and experience is my offering to you. I hope that you, the reader, find strength and hope from my experience. On the outside, we may seem quite different, but we have more in common than it seems on the surface. Join me on this journey. I hope you see yourself along the way. Maybe this book is really about you, and I'm just the one telling the story. This next part is from a chapter 10, Shame on That Fat Ass Sissy. Remember American Bandstand? That was the TV show that featured teenagers dancing to all the new hip hop music. My eldest sister would watch the show with her girlfriends, and because she was often babysitting me, I would be there. One day when I was around 4 years old, my sister was visiting the home of one of her friends, and American Bandstand was on TV. Either my sister or one of her friends noticed one of the teen boy dancers on the show and said something like, "Wow, he's cute." I turned toward the TV, noticed the same teen, and said something like, "Wow, he sure is." A hush fell over the room is an oft-used phrase, but I remember that room almost sounded like a hush. Whatever it was, everything in the room seemed to slow down to almost stillness. And the girls in the room turned toward me with an awkward, eerie slowness. Eventually, my oldest sister explained to me that since I was a boy, I should be making comments about a girl, not another boy. I hadn't noticed any of the girls on the show, so her comments confused me. I also remember the feeling that came over me, which I did not understand, but with which I would become all too familiar. It was a feeling of shame. I knew in that moment that not only had I said something wrong, but also said something that belied who I was, and that I was wrong. When a child is rebuked for saying or doing something wrong, it is generally because it's insensitive, inconsiderate, or hurtful towards another person. It goes against the social norms of a group or society, and it's the responsibility of others in the group to correct the child. My transgression, however, did not offer me a resolution that made sense to me. What had I done wrong? Why was I supposed to be looking for cute girls? I was 4 years old. I only had mentioned the cute boy that I'd noticed because one of my sister's friends mentioned him. Deeper, however, was knowing that a decision had been made on my behalf, that 4-year-old me was wrong. Yes, I had done something wrong, but it went far beyond my behavior. At that moment, I found out that I was wrong, that my being was wrong. That was the first time that I remember shame's distinct sting and the hopelessness that accompanied it. Though I did not have the words or mental schema at the time, I knew in my heart of hearts that I had been condemned. 4-year-old me figured out that the only way to avoid such shame was to not be who I was. 4-year-old me learned in that moment that the rules had just changed. No longer was I just safe to be, I had to act. I understand now that being is a privilege that involves freedom and safety, and at that moment I knew that freedom and safety would no longer be options. To show up who I was, to play, to express myself as a person, whoever that person was becoming, meant to disclose myself, and that came with the risk that I might reveal something shameful about myself. In that moment, I realized that my only option was not to come out and play anymore. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much,
I want
Dan.
to
I
end with
feel like
something
there's,
street.
yeah, well, there's so much to digest there, and I think that's such an indicator of how much there is in the book to really dig into, and I think that's what makes it such an engaging read. Thank you for giving us that reading tonight. So at this time, we do have time for our audience Q&A. So if anyone has a question for one or more of our authors, just go ahead and type those in the chat and I'll make sure they get asked. We do have a couple of questions already coming in, so we'll start with these. This first question is for all three authors. What part of the writing process surprised you the most, especially since you're writing about personal experiences? I'm thinking we could go in reading order. So Dane, do you want to start us off with this one?
What part? Repeat that for me, would you?
Sure. Yeah. What part of the writing process surprised you the most?
That's a hard question. uh, yeah, I'd have to give that some thought. But I think what surprised me the most was that, or how little I read other people's writings. And to be a good writer, almost everyone says the same thing. You have to be a good reader.
Yeah, I think that is it's an old adage for a reason, but it's, it's interesting to see that sometimes that isn't the way that the writing process kind of plays out. So that's definitely a surprise, I would say. Doug, what about you? What was a part of the writing process that surprised you?
There were a couple of them, which I think are pretty important. Um, One was, I mean, hearkening, never having really written anything, memoir or anything other than letters and construction specs. I remember high school and college, they'd say they want something had to be 500 words or something like that. But I would sit down and write two fingers, and that little box at the bottom left of a word processor there would tell you how many words you had written, and I would find I could write 1,500 words like at the drop of a hat. I had these stories in me that I had, and sometimes I could only write in the morning because my eyes would get too tired in the afternoon. But I could knock out 3,000 or 4,000 words in a couple of hours. That really surprised me. Um, and then the other thing that I found surprising, I wanted to know, I said, I need to read somebody else. So I just picked up a John Updike book and I started to read, and I said, oh my God, this guy's a real writer. I'm a hack. And I said, I can't write. I couldn't write, put it down. I put my thing down, and I finally went back to it and I read what I had written, and I could hear my voice. And once I could hear my voice, I realized I could keep writing, just even though I'm not John Updike.
Well, I think that's definitely something inspiring to hear from a published author, but I think also, yeah, sometimes how much how many words can come out of the page or out of the pen once you get started, I think can be very surprising. So
Yeah,
I'm right there with you on that.
yeah.
Dan, what about you? What part of the writing process surprised you the most?
Sharing pieces of this before it came to fruition surprised me in getting feedback from people who are different from me. I mentor a lot of young men, most of them heterosexual in their early adult years. And that's the population I was most afraid of growing up. And they're the ones who've responded to it so positively. And they look at me now as somebody who's like this, I don't know, warrior instead of, I don't know. It's just been a big surprise. Someone also asked me to explain the word Hiraeth, which is a Welsh word. And as a Welsh American, I'm going to put that in the chat pane for everyone. But yeah, and that's how you pronounce it, Hiraeth. Thank you for
Great.
asking.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for that explanation in the chat. So everyone definitely check that out because obviously that's an important word being in the title of Dan's book. This next question is for all three authors. Did you have any feedback from family or friends that challenged your memory of events? Which I think is a huge question for memoirists. Doug, do you want to start us off with this one?
Yes. I have three sisters, and I spoke to at least one of them every single day during writing this, because we all grew up together in a somewhat crazy household, a paralyzed father and an iron lung, and just it was somewhat crazy. Generally, our memories were clear for three of us. And if the fourth was off, I went with the three. So, I mean, no, everybody's memories can be a little bit off always. And, but so yes, the
Yeah.
memories do differ.
I like that kind of averaging out approach. I think that's a really great democratic way to go about it. Because you're right, memory can be it can be a flawed way to store information, let's say that.
Especially when we're talking about stuff from, 60 years ago. So,
Right. Yeah. The longer it gets, the blurrier it becomes.
right.
Dan, what about you? Did you get any feedback from family or friends that challenged your memory of events?
The opposite, it actually opened up conversations. I've known someone for many years, decades, And when I shared a bit of a draft with her, she said, I wasn't aware of all this. But then just a few conversations later, she started opening up to me. She said, there's some things about me you don't know either. And that has begun a new phase of our friendship. So instead of saying I've known her for decades, I get to say I've been learning about her for decades. It's just reframed the whole friendship that we have. It's been great.
Oh yeah, I love that you say that, that it reframed that. I think that's such a beautiful development to happen even so far into a friendship, you could say. So that's a
There's
beautiful
always
thing.
things we don't know about our loved ones and always more to learn.
Absolutely. And being open-minded to that, I think that's fantastic. Dane, what about you? Any feedback from your family or friends which challenged your memory of events?
Actually, no. I do have a brother and sister where we might have some varying ideas about happenings in the past, but I think everyone trusts that I have the memory in our family. My mother, on the other hand, who's 97 right now, and a big part of my book, she's uh, been involved from the beginning, but all of her comments for the earlier months were, I didn't know that. I wish I knew that. I didn't know what was going on. So for me, it was more a matter of family, extended family and friends going, I never knew that about you.
Yeah, I think that's a really, it's a conversation starting way to approach it rather than coming at it from, accusation or something like that. So I think that's, for better or for worse, that can be a good way to get that response from readers. We have a question now. This is for Dan. You wrote that you spent much of your life hiding. How difficult was it to disclose yourself in such an honest memoir, and what drove the decision to write?
It's been a process. And, for those of us who remember that there was a time when, before the internet, you could be out and open in one geographic place and not in another geographic place. So you could be open with your friends here or at work here, but not to your family back home. So in that sense, it's been a process. There was a certain point, though, it was during the pandemic when I just thought, what am I waiting for? Like, it's, big deal. So they kill a senior citizen. Well, not, I wasn't, but anyway, like I just got tired. I just got tired of it, and I got tired of not telling the truth about who I was, especially since I was I mentor, young adults and new adults to start telling the truth and stand up and step into yourself and take up space and use your voice. And there I was holding back, and I just got tired of it.
Yeah, at some point you gotta make a move, so to speak. I hear this idea from many memoirists actually, but I think it's really an important one to hear from you. So thank you for that. This other question came in, which is actually very similar. It's for all three authors, and Dan already touched on this, but what was the first idea or moment that set this book in motion for you? So before I move on, Dan, did you want to add anything about that?
Um, just that when I talk about not hiding, I mean everything that I will mention in the book. It's not just about being gay. It's about the addiction. It's about the health challenges. It's about everything that I was concealing. It just takes such a toll. I'm
Yeah,
so glad to not have that weighing down on me anymore.
I think that's wonderful to hear.
Details in the book.
Dane, yeah, absolutely. Definitely check out those links, everyone. But Dane, what about you? What was the first moment that you thought it's time for me to write this book?
Um, well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I worked on my wife's memoir with her for 6 or 7 years before that was ready to be published. And we talked about the different things in our lives that were book worthy, but so much of it uh, I didn't feel comfortable with it having probably similar feelings to some of Dan's experience because I was in the corporate environment. I was expected to look a certain way and behave a certain way. And being African American back in the 80s and 90s in corporate America wasn't an advantage. In fact, it was a disadvantage. And so I wouldn't have been able to come out with a book like this, uh, talking about race and how I identified, but yet I was playing this game in the corporate environment that I was in. So, but how I got started with this was out of depression. My wife had passed from illness, and I had started writing poetry, just things from the heart. And then that led to a couple of essays. And from the essays, I had maybe 4 or 5 essays that were the pillars of the book. So I thought, well, why not just go ahead? I mean, just quickly, my wife was, I'd come home from work and she'd have all these notes all over her desks on Post-its and things, right? And she would explain to me about these things about her mother. And I said, well, why don't we just put this in a book instead of having it all of these loose items? Because the purpose of it was to set the record straight. That was her terms about the scandal her mother was involved with. Okay, and so anyway, that's what I ended up telling myself is I've got all of these little Post-its around the place with these different experiences. Why not just put those in a book? And I don't have to worry if my boss or someone knows, something that would have been harmful while I was still in those environments. Now I can just be who I am. So of course I'm on my wife was an extreme feminist, and she, gender was a big thing with her. And so I understand that, and I appreciate it when someone like Dan has the courage, to stand out and to work with other people that normally would be adverse to, some of his values, and still be able to function in an advisory position. So kudos to you, Dan.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, I can see that how this development occurred over a longer period of time and these inspirations came to you. So thank you for laying that up for us, Dane. And Doug, closing us out, what was the moment that you knew it was time to put this book together?
I knew exactly when it was. 2.5 years ago, or 2 years and 9 months ago, 8.5 months ago, my wife and I went to a New Year's Eve gathering. And there weren't that many couples there, maybe 3 or 4. And at one point, one of the guys said that he had written a book about growing up in a racist town in Texas. And it was on Amazon. So he was, he thought that was pretty good. And we all talked about it. And at one point I said, I think everybody has a book in them. And a few comments about that, but then we went on to the next subject as conversations move around. And a couple hours later, we got home, and I said to my wife, I said, you know what, Jess, I have a book in me, and I think I'm going to write it. And the next day, I hand wrote what would be chapter headings, close, with a few notes. And then on New Year's Day, I went down to Best Buy, which amazingly was open, and because I needed an upgrade on my computer. It would just die all the time, the old one. So I bought it and started typing that day, and started just with 2 fingers. And eventually
And here we are.
I got 80,000 words out of 2 fingers. So
Well,
you
I
don't
think
have
that's
to
a
be,
really
if you want to write, you don't have to be a great typist, because you can do it with 2 fingers.
a perfect takeaway for that. But I think that's a great testament to, sometimes it just comes out of just a little bit of inspiration and seeing what you can do on your own and with 2 fingers and a laptop. So
Yep.
yeah, thank you for sharing that too, Doug. So at this time, I want to say, we're closing out the hour here, but first, I just want to say it was so wonderful to hear all 3 of these books come to life in the voices of their writers. So to Dane, Doug, and Dan, thank you so much for being generous with your time, your words, all of your thoughts in this Q&A. To everybody in the audience, thank you so much for being here with us to celebrate these authors together. Of course, don't forget that you can order A White Duck in a Black Pond, Our Father Who Art in an Iron Lung, and Hiraeth, The Voice of Home from the links in the chat. I'm just going to put those links all in the chat one more time for you, so they are easily accessible. You don't have to dig through for them, at least not too far. Please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, sign up for our email newsletter, or submit a book manuscript of your own. You can submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and let us know that you attended today's event. We'll look forward to hearing from you, but until then, that's it for tonight. So have a great rest of your week, everyone.